My life was pretty run-of-the-mill, at least until Little Landry's accident. He was my little brother, you see, and was named Little Landry on account of being the little one of us two Landry brothers, and we were named Landry on account of being our Papa Landry's sons. Being the big brother, I had to look out for Little Landry. We'd walk to school together, we'd go to the store together, we'd play games and watch movies together. Papa told us that we Landrys ought to stick together no matter what, and so we did. But I made a big mistake, the kind that no big brother ought to make. We were playing chase, Little Landry and me, but too close to the road. He was just 6 then, and I was 11, so he didn't know any better. When I was there, he was running away from me and ran onto the road. I shouted at him to stop, but he thought it was part of the game, I suppose, so he kept running, right on under the 2-door sedan that was cruising down the road. It's hard to remember much of what happened right after that. I just know that 2 months later, we were back home, us 3 Landrys, but life wasn't so run-of-the-mill no more. Little Landry couldn't do much of anything no more. The doctors said he had broken his neck, broken his face, and cracked his cranium, and that it was a miracle he was alive. But they also said he might not really be alive at all, just sorta there, if you take my meaning. They told Papa Landry that he ought to put Little Landry down with medicine. Papa Landry nearly got arrested then because he was so mad that the doctors told him such a thing. Anywho, we brought Little Landry home with us, because we Landrys ought to stick together no matter what. But he wasn't right no more. His eyes were open all the time, but there were just whites there, like the parts of the eyes you see were rolled up into his head and wouldn't come back out. His mouth was open too, in some kind of lopsided, spread-out smile, like a clown gone drunk or something of the like. And the cuts and stitches from his accident had all kinds of lines and cracks running along his face that were all kinds of wrong. He just laid there in his bed all day and all night, looking all creepy-like, not moving or speaking or anything, like he was dead. But he wasn't dead because he still breathed. It was this sickly sort of crackling sound. And he ate, though you had to move his mouth for him, and he shit, though you had to clean his ass for him. Matter of fact, I had to drop out of school on account of Little Landry needing someone to feed and clean him. Papa said he had to work a lot so we could keep the house and afford Little Landry's needs. So for most of the day, it was just me and Little Landry at home. That was when I started to lose my marbles a bit. I'd sit next to Little Landry, day in and day out, taking care of him, feeding him, cleaning his piss and shit, and even reading books out loud, in case he could hear, or watching TV loud enough in the other room that he could listen. All the while he'd just stare at me with those blank whites of his eyes, and smile at me with that nasty, crooked, cracked-at-the-edges smile. I swear, I started seeing that face in my dreams. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like I could still see Little Landry's nasty mug hanging right over me. It was like when you look at a bright light and then look away, and the bright light is still there, but sort of fading. Little Landry's nasty mug was there, hanging over me, but fading, like he'd been there a moment before or some such. But that was nonsense, because Little Landry never moved. He just laid there in his room, staring at me any time I was around, making that nasty crackling sound with his breathing, which is why it was so peculiar and downright unsettling that day when Papa Landry found that one note. He got home, thumping in through the front door and slamming it shut behind him, and before I could even get up and go say hello, he called out to me. "Landry!" he shouted down the hall. "Get over here!" I walked over right quick and said hello. Papa didn't answer, though. He was staring down at a little sticky note, like the ones you see at the grocery store for school. It was smudged and old, like it had been left for years in some attic, and on the wall, a glittery white patch stuck out from the rest of the dirty wall, where I suppose Papa had grabbed the note from. Papa looked up at me, frowning heavy, and asked, "What's this, boy?" "I don't know," I told him. Papa had a way of crinkling his forehead when he was getting mad, and when I said, "I don't know," he started crinkling his forehead in that way, so I knew I had to watch my step. "I don't know what's got into you, boy, but no more of this nonsense," Papa rumbled. Yes, Papa. Sorry, Papa, I said politely. Papa shoved the note into his pocket, then thumped down the hall to his room. He didn't even look in on little Landry. He rarely did after the first few months. I hadn't put up any note, that was for sure. What did the note say? Why was Papa mad about it? I thought hard about that as I went about my day, and I even checked the trash cans in case Papa had tossed the note. I had no luck on either count, so I figured I'd let it lie. I went back to little Landry's room to get on with my usual thing. There was a book about animals I'd been reading, so I got back to that, reading out loud in case little Landry could hear it. But before long, I noticed the damnedest thing. Others might not have noticed it, but I could have sworn by it, seeing as I spent so much time with little Landry. Little Landry was smiling bigger than ever. That torn and crooked smile of his stretched and curled farther than it had earlier, even that same day. And his crackling breathing was a little louder than usual. I'll be damned if it didn't creep me right out. Especially because his damn eyes hadn't changed a bit. They were still the same blank whites as always. I called Papa over to take a look. He was irate over me bothering him and said it was nonsense and he wouldn't get up from his armchair. I got a bit upset at that and called him out over not checking in on little Landry much. After that, Papa agreed to come see, though he didn't look pleased about it. When he entered the room, little Landry was laying there, same as always, but with that extra wide smile. "See?" I said to Papa. I felt that Papa had gone a little pale, but all he said was, "He's the same as always." I glanced back at little Landry then, and I swear, the extra wide smile settled back into the normal one. "Did you see that?" I said to Papa. Papa's forehead was crinkling. He looked at me, all pale and all wide-eyed. "I didn't see nothing," he grumbled. Then he stomped out of the room, and he didn't stop there. Hell, he stomped right out of the front door. That was the last time I saw Papa. It was just little Landry and me after that, which was a problem on account of my not being able to afford little Landry's needs. I got some advice on that from Laurie, our neighbor, who told me I ought to write the government for help since now little Landry and me were orphans. I had no better idea as to what to do, so I went ahead and took her advice. A few days later, I saw the mailman come round and drop a letter into our mailbox. Hoping it was the government offering to help, I was quick to head out the front door. Laurie happened to be there, out for a walk. I smiled and waved to her as I got to the mailbox. Then I pulled out the letter and saw that it was, in fact, from the government. Just as I ran my finger under its lip to open it up, Laurie spoke to me. "Oh," she said, "your father's back, son. That's good." What an odd question, I thought to myself. With a frown, I replied, "No, ma'am." Laurie sighed and said, "Oh, sorry, hon. Just assumed that's who was in your kitchen." She waved in apology and continued along the sidewalk. Confused, I spun round, and I damn near fell over. I saw the outline of a person in the kitchen behind the mesh curtain, but nobody was home except little Landry and me. Bewildered, I dashed back inside and went straight there. But there was nobody there. The kitchen was the same as always, except for a small yellow note on the wall. I snatched it, leaving a white patch that stood out from the rest of the dusty wall. I looked down, squinting as the paper crackled, and saw big words splayed across the faded yellow of the paper. "Don't." Now that made no sense to me, and it sure as hell didn't answer for why I had seen a figure standing in the kitchen. Nearly wetting myself, I started creeping round the house, expecting to find someone standing around. The floorboards creaked something fierce as I went along, making me even more uneasy. There was nobody in the house, at least not the parts of the house other than little Landry's room. I had almost hoped I'd find some robber or some such in Papa's bedroom, but there was no one, leaving only little Landry's room for me to check. I was shaking as I crept toward his doorway. I'd gone in and out of that room dozens of times each day for as long as I could remember, but in that moment, I was so scared, I almost froze in place. After a long moment, I got to the edge of the doorway, and I tilted my head past it, peeking into the room. Little Landry was there, the same as always, and there wasn't anyone else in the room with him. I stayed frozen in the doorway, my eyes locked with that blank stare of his, imagining how he might have gotten up and walked to the kitchen, then stood there and just watched all creepy-like as Laurie and me talked outside. But that made no sense. Little Landry never moved. He just laid there, staring blankly and smiling all day and all night. Maybe the figure we saw had just been a trick of the light, I thought to myself. I didn't quite believe that. But what else was I going to tell myself? I went back to the kitchen and got back to opening the envelope from the government. After I read the letter, I had to sit down for a while, just trying to make sense of things. You see, the government said that they wanted to send me to a boarding school where I'd be taken care of, and even said they'd cover the costs of it. That didn't sound so bad in itself, but the problem was that they also said it was time to pull the plug, so to speak, on little Landry. They said it would have to be my decision, since Papa wasn't around no more. I was all shaken up, and honestly, that was mostly on account of me wanting to agree to it. Little Landry ran under that car way back when, because I was a bad big brother. And now I was considering calling it good on his behalf and taking away what life he had left, making me an even worse big brother. And yet, I so wanted to just go along with it. I wanted to move on. Was that wrong? I was mulling it over the next day, still undecided, when I saw it. Another note, just like the first. This one really took me by surprise because I was on the shitter when I noticed it. I reached over to grab some toilet paper and it was right goddamn there, next to my face. The paper crackled, the air feeling strangely warm around it as I peeled it off the wall. The writing was on the underside this time. Don't, I swear. If I hadn't just shit, I would have shit myself. I cleaned up and got out of that bathroom as quick as I could, and I ran toward little Landry's room. He was lying there, as always, except for his smile. It was that extra-wide smile again, I could have sworn. The sight of it made my hair stand on end, and honestly, I lost it then. I shouted at little Landry. "Cut the shit!" I roared at him. "Why won't you say anything or do anything?" I screamed. He just laid there, as goddang always does. I kept shouting, and unsurprisingly, he didn't respond in any way. Damn, I'm losing it. I thought to myself after that. I grabbed our phone and collared up the number from the government letter that same day. I told them I was good to go along with their plans for me and little Landry. I just had to get out of there. It was 3 days before the hospital people came to take little Landry. And in those 3 days, there were notes. So many notes all around the house. I was really losing it, I told myself, as I tore the crackling notes off the walls, not even bothering to read them anymore. By the time the hospital people arrived, the walls were downright littered with those glittery white patches. And then little Landry was gone. They placed him on a stretcher and took him away to be put down. I thought I'd feel relieved, but I didn't, not at all. I sat on the front porch with my bags all packed for the entire rest of that day as I waited for my ride to pick me up and send me off to boarding school. I expected I'd be nervous going into boarding school, but man, I was so rattled after everything that happened back home that I had no energy for that. When I got to the school, all I could think about was getting to my room and going to bed. After having a tour of the school and meeting my teachers, I was allowed to go to my dorm room. I had the room to myself, which was a relief because it meant I could go right to bed without being bothered. I didn't sleep good that night because I dreamt of little Landry. That awful smile of his, that crackling breathing, and those blank eyes. At one point I woke up, and there he was again. That fading image of him, as though he was slouched over top of me just a moment ago. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, my room dimly lit by the lamp at my bedside. And then I saw it. My bones just sort of melted as I stared across my room at the wall opposite my bed. A small, pale yellow note. I nearly choked on my fear as I inched off my bed. I tiptoed toward the note, feeling all woozy. I peeled the paper off the wall, leaving a patch that was less obvious than the ones back home, but still there. I held the note up to my eyes real close, since it was tough to see in the gloom. "Bad brother," it said. Frozen in a carnal sort of terror, I lowered the note as I struggled for air. And then I noticed something on account of the dormitory wall being a lot cleaner than the walls back home. The white patch looked sort of odd. I leaned in close, real close, bringing myself to the right level with the patch. And I saw that the patch wasn't really a patch. It was more of a hole in the wall, and the white that bulged from the opening had an outward curve to it and glistened a little in the light, like the white of an eye. And then I heard it, even though the paper was perfectly still in my hand, crackling, breathing. My sleepy rural county isn't the most exciting place to be a police officer, so I volunteered for the patrol at the old facility. Apparently, some local teens had been using the abandoned building as a place to drink beers, smoke weed, and spray paint huge pictures of dicks on the walls. In an effort to appease the grumpy neighbors who had reported the juveniles, my CO said we should post someone outside of the building for a few nights to scare off the delinquents. I jumped on the opportunity. There is nothing better than getting paid to sit in your car and play games on your phone. I got bored fast. It turns out most mobile games these days follow the freemium model. I decided to get out of the car and stretch my legs. I'd never actually been this close to the facility before. I'd heard the rumors. The town was full of them. One rumor said the building was used as a CIA black site to detain and torture terrorists. One was that the building housed a secret lab to pull precious metals from alternate dimensions. One rumor, particularly a bonkers rumor that was proliferated by the town conspiracy theorist, said the clearly 70s-era piece of brutalist architecture was, in fact, ancient, and had been constructed by a race of aliens. In truth, all I really knew for sure was that the building was built by the government in the 1970s and abandoned in the 1990s. All this to say, I was curious about the building, and I had a perfect excuse to freely wander its halls. I found the busted window the kids had been using as an entry and pulled myself through. The air in the facility was thick with dust and had the smell of mildew. With most of the windows boarded up, the interior was pitch black, with the exception of a few columns of moonlight and the beam of my flashlight that cut through the nearby darkness but flung monstrous shadows into the distance. I walked slowly down the corridor. My footsteps sent reverberations off the concrete floors and walls of the deserted structure. The place was eerie, and I was about to turn back when I heard what sounded like the soft crunch of a boot on glass from further inside the building. Quietly, I made my way further down the hallway towards the sound, hoping that what I had heard was nothing more than a mouse or a cat that had taken refuge in the long, vacant facility. The hair on my neck stood at attention as I turned each corner. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I opened each door. Each time I found nothing. Eventually, I found the room the teens had been using as their den. It seemed to have been a cafeteria back when the building was operational, but now it was nothing more than a large, dark room with rotting tables and drapes of cobwebs in every corner. Smashed beer bottles littered the floor, along with dozens of half-burned candles and candy wrappers. A box of chalk lay on the ground next to some sort of intricate design it had been used to draw. I didn't pay it much mind. Feeling better about being alone in the building, I decided to head back to the squad car when I noticed a door that stood out against any of the others I'd seen so far in my exploration. It was large, black, steel, and chained shut. I wandered over and tugged on the chains that had long rusted from years of neglect. I thought it strange, but I wanted to get out of the building, so I ignored it and headed back to the car. I played a few more mobile games and scrolled for a bit on Reddit, but I couldn't get that door out of my head. What was in there? Why would one room be locked so securely while the rest of the building was essentially wide open? What was in there? The thought ate away at me until I made the decision to go back in. I popped the trunk of the car, took out the bolt cutters, and headed back into the dark building. After years of rusting in the damp building, the chains broke easily and fell to the concrete floor with a thud that echoed through the empty corridors. I pulled the heavy steel door open and revealed a staircase that descended deeper into the mysterious darkness below. A line of white powder lay across the top step. I brushed my foot across it. Salt, maybe. I'm not sure. With great trepidation, I started down the staircase. The heavy door slammed behind me with a heavy thud that made me jump. As I descended, the air became noticeably colder, and a chill rushed up my spine. I could almost feel the weight of the building pressing down on me as I moved towards its hidden secret. At the bottom of the staircase was a room. I washed the walls with the light of my flashlight. Just a plain square room with the yellow paint on the walls, chipping off with age. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed what was in the center of the room, a skeleton. It was lying face down on the cement floor, and a pair of shackles were fastened around each of its ankles. I took a step towards the pile of bones to inspect it more closely when my flashlight flickered once, twice, and then, all of a sudden, I was plunged into darkness. A muttered curse escaped my lips as I feverishly slapped my flashlight with my palm, trying to bring it back to life. In the pitch black, I strained my ears and eyes, trying to reorient myself in the room, when I felt a sudden awareness that I wasn't alone. A subtle rustle and the soft echoes of thin breathing reached my ears. I fumbled for my radio, intending to call for backup, but found, like my flashlight, the radio was dead as well. Panic gripped me, and I tried to steady my breathing, wanting to stay as still and quiet as possible while I waited for my eyes to adjust. Slowly, something emerged from the darkness. A silhouette, blacker than the darkness around it, became visible. Someone or something was standing in the corner of the room. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice echoing off the walls. I reached for my service weapon, only to find it was missing. My holster was empty. Had I been disarmed? My panic intensified. A soft shuffling behind me caused me to whip around in that direction. "Who's there?" I called again. 2 pinpricks of yellow light peered at me from the far side of the room, near the base of the staircase where I entered. I stared in fear as the 2 pinpricks of light flickered out, then reappeared seconds later, a few feet to my right. Another shuffling sound came from behind me, and I spun around again and shouted, "This is the police! Who is there?" I stood in the inky blackness, completely blind and too scared to even breathe, when I felt the warm breath of someone standing directly in front of me. I swung my fist out, but found only air. Then yet another sound came from behind me. It was the loud grating of the steel door being pushed open. What little light there was on the ground floor of the building filtered in through the now open door and provided just enough light for me to find the staircase. I bolted. I ran up the stairs through the steel door and out to my car in under a minute. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, shaking like a leaf in the wind, when I made the decision to call in backup. I don't care if I get in trouble for losing my gun, or if I get bullied relentlessly for calling in backup on what was probably a bunch of teenagers. I grabbed my radio when it sprung to life in my hand. "James, are you all right? Additional officers are being dispatched to your location. Stay put." What? How would they have known what just happened? I didn't call for backup. "Backup?" I questioned the radio. "Yes, James. We've heard nothing but screams from your radio for the last 10 minutes. It's still coming through now. Are you not hearing that?" the dispatcher asked me. "No," I replied. "I don't hear anything. I haven't even used my radio." "Can you patch it through on my end? Maybe there's a glitch, or we're catching up another signal." "Sure," the radio crackled back. "You're not going to like it." The speakers in my squad car exploded into the blood-curdling screams of a woman crying for help. Her voice was strained and cracked in places, the kind of scream someone could only make if they were fighting for their lives. Okay, enough!" I shouted into the radio. The screaming stopped for a moment, before the radio crackled to life again. "You know what? If you're saying everything is all right on your end, then I actually have a different address for you to check out. You can leave that dump you've been sitting at all night. We're getting a crazy number of calls all of a sudden." The dispatcher sent me an address and asked me to follow up once I'd arrived. I took one last look at the building before I pulled out of the empty parking lot. As I was rolling up my window about to drive off, I heard, faintly and distantly, just loud enough to make me question if it was a figment of my own imagination, the same woman's scream that had apparently been broadcast through my radio. My stomach turned into knots. I knew that building was empty. I knew there was no one left in there. Something deep in the dark labyrinth of hallways was trying to lure me in. With a shudder, I drove off. More strange things happened that night. In a town of roughly 400, our small precinct received 12 suicide calls, and when we arrived at the addresses given, no one there claimed to have made a call. We received multiple calls of fire that also turned out to be hoaxes. I personally responded to several calls of home intrusion, only for a search of the homes to turn up nothing. One man claimed to have cornered an intruder in his hallway closet, only for it to be empty when I arrived to open the door. That night, a small 4-seat Cessna 182 was flying directly overhead of our town when, all of a sudden, it vanished. It disappeared off the radar. No crash was reported, and a 2-week search after the fact turned up nothing. The most disturbing thing that started happening were the body parts. Every now and then, a random foot, finger, or hand would show up. They were usually called in to us after the neighborhood dogs would cheerily drop them off on their family's doorstep. Always a hand, finger, or foot. Nothing more. Unexplained things were happening in my own home as well. I'd come home from work and lay down on the couch, exhausted. I'd be towing the line on the barrier between awake and asleep when I'd hear my front door open and footsteps walk past me and down the hall. Thinking it was my girlfriend, I'd call out to her, only to realize she wasn't expected home from work for another few hours. People started to move out, but no one moved in. Within a year, the population was cut in half. Another year, and it was cut in half again. I left during the 3rd year. Everyone else who was left did too. Eminent domain. The government owns the land now. We were told it was for a military base, but the last rumor I heard was that. The construction was centered on that old government facility I wandered through many years ago. I loved my time in that little town, although I don't have much to remember it by. I just can't help but worry that what happened there was my fault. What was it that I unleashed, and what if it spreads? We received multiple calls of fire that also turned out to be hoaxes. I personally responded to several calls of home intrusion, only for a search of the homes to turn up nothing. One man claimed to have cornered an intruder in his hallway closet, only for it to be empty when I arrived to open the door. That night, a small 4-seat Cessna 182 was flying directly overhead of our town when, all of a sudden, it vanished. It disappeared off the radar. No crash was reported, and a 2-week search after the fact turned up nothing. The most disturbing thing that started happening were the body parts. Every now and then, a random foot, finger, or hand would show up. They were usually called in to us after the neighborhood dogs would cheerily drop them off on their family's doorstep. Always a hand, finger, or foot. Nothing more. Unexplained things were happening in my own home as well. I'd come home from work and lay down on the couch, exhausted. I'd be towing the line on the barrier between awake and asleep when I'd hear my front door open and footsteps walk past me and down the hall. Thinking it was my girlfriend, I'd call out to her, only to realize she wasn't expected home from work for another few hours. People started to move out, but no one moved in. Within a year, the population was cut in half. Another year, and it was cut in half again. I left during the 3rd year. Everyone else who was left did too. Eminent domain. The government owns the land now. We were told it was for a military base, but the last rumor I heard was that. The construction was centered on that old government facility I wandered through many years ago. I loved my time in that little town, although I don't have much to remember it by. I just can't help but worry that What happened there was my fault. What was it that I unleashed? And what if it spreads? "Matt, is that really you?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. He didn't answer, but instead took a step closer to me. His eyes narrowed, and I could see a savage hunger in them. I realized then that this wasn't my brother. This was something entirely different, something that had taken over his body. I tried to back away slowly, but he lunged forward, his hands outstretched and his teeth bared. I screamed and ran out of the cabin as fast as I could. I could hear him chasing me, his inhuman growls echoing through the forest. I wasn't sure how long I ran for, but eventually I found a stream. I plunged into the water, hoping to lose whatever was chasing me. I stayed in the water for what felt like hours, my body shivering from the cold. Finally, I mustered up enough courage to climb out and continue my journey. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned around, I saw nothing but darkness and trees. I realized then that I had to find a way out of the woods, and fast. As the dawn broke, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of it stood an old tree. It was unlike any tree I had ever seen before. The bark was black and twisted, and the branches hung low, blocking out the sunlight. I felt drawn to it as if it were calling out to me. As I stepped closer, I saw something etched into the bark. It was a symbol I had never seen before, but it was pulsating with an eerie energy. The stench of rotten flesh and sulfur permeated the air around the tree. The air felt heavy and damp. There was a tangy, bitter smell in the air, an odor of decay and death about it, though very faint. I knew then that this was the source of the evil that my brother had warned me about. And as I stood there, staring at the symbol, I could feel something inside of me, stirring. It was like a dark force was calling out to me, tempting me, and I knew that if I didn't get out of there soon, I would be lost forever. But just as I turned to run, something grabbed me from behind. I tried to scream, but a cold hand clamped over my mouth, muffling my cries for help. I struggled against my attacker, but it was of no use. They were too strong. The world began to spin as I was lifted off my feet and carried deeper into the woods. I caught a glimpse of my captor's face, and I knew then that it was my brother. But he was no longer the Matt I had known and loved. He was a monster, a vessel for the evil that lurked inside those woods. I don't know how long I was held captive, but it felt like an eternity. In that darkness, I was subjected to unspeakable horrors that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was beaten, starved, and forced to endure all manner of physical and psychological abuse. But worst of all was the feeling of utter hopelessness that consumed me. I was trapped in that place, with no way out. But one day, I woke up to find that my captor was gone. I don't know how or why, but I didn't care. I knew that this was my chance to escape. I stumbled out of the cabin, my body weak and trembling. But as I made my way through the woods, I could feel something inside of me changing. It was like the darkness had taken root in my soul, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it off. Ever since then, I've been sick. There's something wrong, and the doctors don't know what it is. There's no treatment for my symptoms, not for the sleepwalking, the fever dreams, or the strange necrosis that's slowly eating me from the inside. They can't tell me whether I'll ever get better or how much time I might have left before it's too late. The darkness that had taken over my brother's body somehow seeped into mine, corrupting me from the inside out. But I fear that it may be too late for me. The necrosis continues to spread, and I can feel my mind slipping away. Sometimes I wonder if it's all in my head, if the darkness is nothing more than a figment of my imagination. But then I see the marks on my body, the scars that refuse to heal, and I know that it's as real as the look in my brother's eyes the night he shared his curse with me. Pretty much every day was the same for me. Get up, brush teeth, shower, get dressed, breakfast, then out the door for work. I lived alone for a while, and it seemed to work out pretty fine for the longest time. But just like most people experience, spending most of your time alone eventually becomes pretty lonely. I was beginning to feel as if a roommate could be a good idea. Asking around to coworkers who maybe knew of anyone in need of a roommate ended in nothing. I asked around to the few friends that I had the very same question and still got the same answer. No. I started to think it was pointless to even try anymore. Nobody needed or wanted a roommate. Honestly, I gave up. For another 2 weeks after that, everything remained the same. Loneliness and the same old repetitive days. Until I remembered the power of Facebook. I started to think that there had to be at least some sort of group in my area that was searching for the same thing I was. Thankfully, I was right. It didn't take me very long to find a group that seemed suitable for me to make my post. Looking back, I feel a bit stupid that it took me this long to even try social media. Probably because I've just never really been a big fan. I began making my post. Searching for a roommate in the local area. I added in extra details in the comments about what would be preferable in a roommate to live with. To my surprise, I started getting replies. To be honest, once I checked out most of the profiles, it didn't seem to be a good fit. Not trying to be discouraged by this, I just logged off for a bit and gave it some more time. When I woke up the next morning, I was honestly a little excited to see if my post got any more replies. Logging into my account, I was pleasantly surprised to see I had gotten 2 more. One of them said, "My buddy Brian would probably be interested." They put a link to this profile after that, so I decided to check it out. From what I saw just browsing around on his profile, he seemed like your average guy. He seemed pretty laid back and clean. He didn't appear to come off as annoying. I figured we'd get along well, and it would give me someone to talk to and hang out with when I wasn't at work. I got along pretty well with my coworkers, but they just weren't exactly the type I wanted to hang out with once I clocked out. I messaged Brian and told him that his friend mentioned he may be interested in a roommate in a post I made. About an hour later, Brian responded and told me that he was. He was staying in a place with another friend of his who just bailed on him and left him with all of the bills. And it was getting hard for him to afford to stay there. We worked things out, and within a short time, Brian had moved in with me. Everything was pretty cool. We got along pretty well, and everything was working out. I woke up for work one morning and checked my phone to see if I had any texts or calls. I had 3 missed texts. One from my mother telling me goodnight and she loved me. One from a friend just saying, "How you been?" The last one is what started this whole ordeal. From an unknown number, I had a text that was just a single picture of a man with his eyes blindfolded lying in bed. Obviously, I thought that was insanely creepy. I texted, "Who is this?" I never got an answer, and I brushed it off as some weirdo just playing a dumb prank, especially because the number was way out of an area code I was in, and I already had everyone's number I would even speak to. From that morning forward, every morning became absolute hell. I woke up every morning to these awful pictures of a man in awkward poses with a blindfold on that covered most of his face. I tried calling and texting this number more times than I can count, and I've never gotten a reply. After about 2 weeks of this, I got the same type of text. Only this time it was from a different number. My roommate Brian had left a little earlier than usual for a morning shift. With just me in the house, I called this new number that was sending me the same type of picture. My entire body started to shake when I heard a phone ring from the kitchen. Brian had forgotten to grab one of his phones before he left. This whole time, the man in the pictures was me. I'm not letting Brian back into this house.